You're listening to Murder Not Murdering with Erin,
And Autumn,
a true crime podcast about murder and murdering.
but we are not murderers.
Yeah. No. Welcome back to Murder Not Murdering with Autumn and Erin, the coolest podcasters you know. Or maybe the only podcasters you know. I don't know your life.
Who knows your life?
I don't
Not
know
us.
their life. Not us. We don't know.
Well, you guys, I successfully got Autumn to welcome us back in.
She's a bully.
Forcibly, because I just won't speak. So somebody has to do it. And it's Autumn.
She's a bully.
All right. Well, over this last weekend, like we talked about before, I was in our White Center Pride festival that we have every year. And I have to say, it was the most fun I have ever had in my entire life DJing.
I thought you were going to say in your entire life. And I was going to say, wow.
Yeah. Well, it was so much fun though. Like I've never, there was a wonderful crowd of people and I usually plan everything so detailed. And I just went up there with not a plan at all and DJ'd out of my heart. And it was just so much fun. There was like a sing along portion and everybody was participating. Then I had skaters out there and they were all up on a giant stage skating. It was just really, really fun. I know Autumn posted a video on our Instagram page of it, just
I
showing
did.
you a glimpse into the other side of my life. I talk about murder and play music for people. So, yeah, those are my things. Oh, and, like a mom, business owner, et cetera, et cetera. But
Et cetera, et cetera.
a little bit of everything. Anyway, it was just amazing. It was such an incredible turnout and it rained part of the morning and I didn't know what to expect. And then it cleared up right before we had go-go dancers and DJs on and the drag queens that we had earlier in the day, like went out there and fucking busted it out for all of the people in the rain. It was magical. And the fact that the crowds were still just as big and people braved that just to be at that pride celebration was incredible. And I love my neighborhood and I love my community. And it was just awesome.
I love that for you.
Also, speaking of events, the
Oh.
World Cup is about to happen
Oh,
here.
I was like, where is this going?
Well, it's taking over all of Seattle and beyond. So this is a big deal happening right now. And I have no idea what to expect. Like I know that it's being flooded with tons and tons of people, but I just don't know what to expect. They're doing a viewing party here in our neighborhood with multiple giant screens posted throughout. I have no idea what it's going to look like, but I'm not a huge sports gal. So that's a thing.
I'm not a huge soccer fan, I'll be honest. It's not my favorite sport, but I'm excited for the World Cup to be here because lots of people do like soccer. And my brother's girlfriend works downtown and she out her office window, she works like in a high rise. She was looking and they were like creating some kind of barge for watching the game on. And I was like, that's kind of cool. Like here in Seattle, you can be out on the water on a barge in the middle of the sound watching the World Cup that's happening just a couple feet away from you inside the stadium, which they have to call Seattle Stadium and it's not Lumen Field anymore during the World Cup time.
Oh, that's weird. I didn't even know that.
Yeah, it's something to do with branding and whatnot. They had to change Lumen Field to Seattle Stadium.
Okay, whatever. I'm not a big sports fan, but I love being at sports. I like being like part of the camaraderie. That part I enjoy.
Yeah.
One of the things I love about soccer, because our good friend Tim and his husband Matt are
Yes, they love soccer.
big soccer fans, and especially Matt. Matt plays on leagues, and then he also they're big Sounders fans and all of that. But I've been able to go to a few matches with them when someone else couldn't make it. Then they call me because I live close by. So it's just so fun. I love all the songs. I love all of that. I love Ted Lasso, so I like soccer, sort of. Um, but anyway, I love all of the camaraderie of it. I love all of that part. I also love that soccer can be really shady too. That part I like. So I'm excited about what's coming up. And I think hopefully it'll be a really great thing for our city. And yeah, that's something that's happening soon. But even beyond that, it's still Pride Month, which is it's June if you're listening, and who knows what time you're listening. Could be 3 years from now. Oh, no one knows. Anyway, it's June
We
currently.
don't know your life. We've already said this.
We've established that. It's very clear. But for us, it's currently June and Pride Month here, and we are really happy to bring you Pride episodes the rest of this month. So we're going to be focusing on cases that involve LGBTQIA+. I know that Autumn has an international story for us today, and I'm going to take us back old school. So I think if you're ready, Autumn, I'm ready to hear your case.
I'm ready.
Then let's fucking do this.
Let's do this. It's a very sad one, obviously, but
Yeah, it's
also
murder.
very important. And it starts off in the 80s, which is kind of my jam. And then it brings us to actually last month, May 2026.
Snap. Okay.
So here we are, guys. Get ready. This, I'm going to call it The Cliff at North Head, the
Ooh.
death of Scott Johnson. December 1988, Sydney, Australia. The city was heading into summer. Tourists crowded the beaches. The harbor sparkled beneath the sun. Christmas decorations had begun appearing in storefront windows. To anyone looking from the outside, it seemed like the kind of place where people came to build a life. And for one young American, that's exactly what he was trying to do. 27-year-old Scott Johnson had crossed an ocean for love. He was brilliant, kind, and by all accounts had an exciting future ahead of him. He was pursuing a PhD in mathematics, living in Australia with the man he loved, and building a life that should have stretched decades into the future. Instead, just days after his 27th birthday, Scott would be found dead at the base of a cliff overlooking the ocean. Police quickly reached a conclusion: suicide. Case closed. But Scott's family never believed it, especially his older brother, Steve. What followed would become a decades-long fight that would challenge police findings, expose a disturbing pattern of violence, and enforce for an entire country to confront a darker chapter in its history. Because as Steve would eventually discover, Scott may not have been the only young man who died near Sydney's cliffs. And the truth, if there was one, had been buried for more than 30 years. This is the story of Scott Johnson. Scott Russell Johnson was born on November 27, 1961, in Los Angeles County, California. From an early age, he was known for being exceptionally intelligent. But when people talked about Scott, they rarely started with his intelligence. They talked about his warmth, his curiosity, his sense of humor, the way he connected with people, the way he made them feel seen. He loved mathematics, but he wasn't the stereotype of a detached academic buried in books. Friends described him as thoughtful and engaging. He was the kind of person who could spend hours discussing complicated ideas and then just as easily laugh over dinner with friends. In 1983, Scott moved to England to study mathematics at the University of Cambridge. It was there that he met a man named Michael None. Michael was an Australian musicologist. The two fell in love. Today, that might sound simple, but in the early 1980s, being openly gay was still difficult in many parts of the world. Relationships often existed behind closed doors. Acceptance was far from guaranteed. For Scott and Michael, however, what they found in each other was worth pursuing. Eventually, Scott left his doctoral program at Berkeley and moved to Australia. Part of the mood was academic, but part of it was personal. He enrolled at the Australian National University to continue his PhD. But perhaps more importantly, he moved there to be with Michael. The future appeared bright. Scott had found love. He had found purpose. And he had every reason to believe his life was only beginning. Then came December of 1988. Just days after celebrating his birthday, Scott vanished. On December 10th, his naked body was discovered on rocks below a cliff at Bluefish Point in an area known as North Head, near Manly. The scene immediately raised questions. Scott's clothing and personal belongings were found at the top of the cliff. His body was below. Police investigated, but almost immediately they focused on a single explanation: suicide.
But who commits suicide and gets naked that just seems a little
And it
suspect right
seems
off the bat.
really strange to me too. Like, why are you taking your clothes off to jump off a cliff and die?
Yeah.
Like, why would you take your clothes off for that?
Yeah.
It
just
just
seems
doesn't make sense.
It seems very odd.
Yeah, it does seem very odd. I mean,
And that
especially
that's all left up top too.
yes, it's
That
like
seems
left up
weird.
there for it's just very strange.
Yeah.
Authorities theorized that Scott had removed his clothes and jumped. To investigators, the case seemed straightforward. To Scott's family, it made absolutely no sense.
No, he's
Scott-
just starting a life.
Yes, Scott wasn't suicidal. He was making plans. He was pursuing his degree. He was in a loving relationship, and he had recently celebrated his birthday. Nothing about the picture police painted matched the man they knew. Still, despite those concerns, the case remained closed. Years passed, then more years, eventually decades. Most families would have had little choice but to accept the official ruling. Steve Johnson couldn't. Steve had been incredibly close with his younger brother. Not just siblings, friends. Best friends. The kind of brothers who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. And the more Steve examined the circumstances surrounding Scott's death, the more convinced he became that something wasn't right. Questions lingered. Why would Scott suddenly take his own life? Why had investigators been so quick to settle on suicide? What if they had gotten it wrong? Steve began digging, then digging deeper, and then deeper still. What started as a brother searching for answers slowly transformed into a mission that would consume years of his life. As Steve investigated, he began learning something troubling. Scott's death wasn't the only one. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, reports had surfaced of gay men being attacked around Sydney. Some had been beaten, some had disappeared. Some had died near cliffs and coastal areas. In many cases, little attention had been paid to the possibility that these incidents were connected. For years, stories circulated about groups of young men targeting gay men. Victims were allegedly assaulted, robbed, and in some cases thrown from cliffs. Yet many of these deaths had never received the scrutiny they deserved. As Steve learned
It's
more,
also weird to me that they wouldn't connect them. Multiple cliff deaths
right,
seems like they'd stand out.
right, and if they're thinking they're all suicide or whatnot, I mean, there's a pandemic there of suicidal humans. Like,
Yeah, a
it still
trend,
does.
it's
Yes,
something
it's
you would
still
look at. You know what I mean?
100%. It's something that should have been looked into regardless.
Totally.
As Steve learned more, he became convinced that Scott's case belonged within this larger pattern. Not because he wanted it to, because the evidence increasingly suggested it. And so he kept pushing. He petitioned authorities. He requested reviews. He challenged conclusions.
Good for Steve.
Agreed. And he spent extraordinary amounts of time and money pursuing the truth. The fight became so significant that coroners eventually revisited the case. Not once, twice. In 2012, an inquest examined Scott's death. Then another followed in 2017.
God, that's so long after it actually happened. It
Mhm.
surprises me that it took that long.
Unfortunately, it did.
Yeah.
That second inquest would prove especially significant. After reviewing the evidence, a coroner concluded that Scott had died as the result of a gay hate attack. Nearly 30 years after Scott's death, the official narrative had dramatically changed. The ruling validated what Steve had believed all along. His brother had not taken his own life. He had been killed. The findings sent shockwaves through Australia, not only because of Scott's case, but because of what it suggested about countless others. Suddenly, long ignored allegations of anti-gay violence along Sydney's coastline were receiving renewed attention. Questions that had been dismissed for decades were being asked again. Families who had spent years searching for answers saw renewed hope.
Look at what
Police-
Steve did. I'm so
Mhm.
impressed with him that
Me
did
too.
push for countless people to find out answers.
Me too. Police eventually issued a public apology for failures in how Scott's case had been handled and for shortcomings in protecting the gay community during that era. But an apology wasn't enough. Someone had killed Scott. And Steve wanted accountability. In 2018, authorities offered a reward of 1 million Australian dollars for information.
That's a significant amount.
And the Johnson family later increased that amount to 2 million.
Oh my God.
The reward generated headlines. It also generated leads. Then, in May of 2020, a major breakthrough arrived. For decades, police had not identified a suspect. The breakthrough didn't come from forensic evidence or a witness who suddenly remembered seeing something. It came from information provided by a man named Paul Brine, who was the former brother-in-law of a man named Scott White. According to investigators, Brine told police that years earlier, Scott White had allegedly made admissions about being involved in Scott Johnson's death. Brine claimed White described participating in what was essentially a gay bashing attack at North Head and said Johnson had gone over the cliff during a confrontation.
Why didn't he say anything before?
I don't know. But I
Oh.
also am like, a confrontation, he was not clothed.
No.
So he clearly something larger was
Yeah.
happening. not by his choice, obviously.
Yes.
That information became particularly important after the 2017 coroner's finding that Scott Johnson had likely died in a gay hate attack. Police began re-examining old leads and interviewing people connected to the area and the social circles involved at the time. Police arrested Scott White. For Steve Johnson, the moment was overwhelming. More than 31 years had passed. 31 years of questions, 31 years of frustration, 31 years of refusing to quit. When speaking publicly about the arrest, Steve described Scott as his best friend. And for the first time in decades, it seemed possible that answers were finally within reach. The case moved through the courts. In January 2022, Scott White changed his plea and admitted guilt in Scott Johnson's death. The admission stunned observers. For years, the case had appeared unsolvable. Now, there was a confession. Scott White was convicted of murder. Later that year, he was sentenced to prison. Yet, the legal proceedings weren't over. Questions emerged surrounding the plea itself. White later withdrew his guilty plea. His murder conviction was overturned on appeal. In 2023, he pled guilty instead to manslaughter. He was resentenced to 9 years in prison on June 8th, 2023, with eligibility for parole after 6 years. He will be eligible for parole in 2026. In May of 2026, it was reported that Scott White withdrew an application for parole. The legal outcome provided a measure of accountability, but it also left lingering questions. Some observers questioned aspects of the investigation. Others questioned whether the full truth had ever been uncovered. And in 2025, new reporting revisited the case again, raising additional concerns about evidence and the circumstances surrounding the conviction. Even after decades of investigation, certain questions remain. The case against White was complicated, though, which is one reason it remains somewhat controversial today. Some of those issues include there was no DNA evidence linking White to the crime. The case relied heavily on witness statements and alleged admissions. White's 2022 guilty plea to murder was highly unusual and later challenged by his own lawyers. The murder conviction was ultimately overturned, which later White pleaded guilty to manslaughter instead. Subsequent reporting has raised questions about aspects of the investigation and the reliability of certain evidence. Because of that, some people view White's guilty plea to manslaughter as confirmation that authorities found the right person, while others believe there are still unanswered questions about exactly what happened on that cliff in December 1988.
Part of me wonders if was he the only person involved too. The
Was he
other
the
thing
only
is,
one?
and I don't know if you have the answer to this, but did his brother profit from telling police
No.
about him? Like, did he get any
I-
of the reward?
His brother-in-law, I don't know. They
I'm
didn't
just wondering
disclose
if
that.
I'm just
Mhm.
wondering if that could be a possible motive. Like he goes to
'Cause
prison
he
and
had-
then yeah,
and then he gets $2 million. Yeah,
exactly.
I'm not sure. It didn't say.
Yeah.
Which is fitting because the story has always been about uncertainty, about searching for truth, about refusing to accept easy answers, and about a brother who simply would not give up. When I think about Scott Johnson's story, I don't think about the court cases. I don't think first about the inquests. I don't think first about the mystery. I think about a young man who crossed the world to be with someone he loved, a mathematician, a son, a brother, a partner, a person who should have had decades more birthdays. And I think about Steve. Because most of us hope that if something happened to us, somebody would keep looking. Somebody would keep asking questions. Somebody would refuse to let our story disappear. Steve Johnson became that person. For more than 30 years, he carried his brother's memory into courtrooms, investigations, news stories, and public conversations. Not because it was easy, not because it was convenient, but because he believed Scott deserved the truth. Whether every question has been answered may still be up for debate. But one thing isn't. Scott Johnson was never forgotten. His name survived. His story survived. And because one brother refused to stop searching, the world was forced to look again. Sometimes justice arrives quickly. Sometimes it takes decades. And sometimes the most powerful act isn't solving a mystery. It's refusing to let the mystery be ignored. Michael Nolan's story after Scott's death is actually quite sad and often gets overshadowed by Steve's fight for justice. Michael was Scott's partner of about 5 years. They met at Cambridge in 1984, and Scott eventually moved to Australia, largely so that he could build a life together. They were serious enough that they had written each other into their wills, which was one of the few ways same-sex couples could create legal protections at the time.
Most definitely.
After Scott died, Michael was devastated. During later inquests, he described Scott as not just his partner, but also his best friend. He testified that he suffered what was described as a complete emotional breakdown following the death. One detail that really illustrates the climate of the late 1980s is that Michael initially told police they were very good friends rather than lovers.
That's so sad.
It is sad. It breaks my heart. He later explained that he was worried if investigators knew Scott was gay, they would simply assume it was suicide and stop investigating. Over time, Michael and Steve Johnson developed a very strained relationship. They disagreed about what happened to Scott, and there were accusations and tensions that lasted for decades. Eventually, they stopped working together on the case. As for Michael's later life, he continues his academic career as a musicologist. He worked in Hong Kong, New York, and later Massachusetts. He eventually became chair of the music department at Boston College. According to a 2025 profile, he lives in Massachusetts with his husband, whom he married years later. One interesting twist is that Michael was actually one of the people who helped steer Steve toward the possibility that Scott had been the victim of a gay hate attack. After learning more about the gay bashing murders being re-examined in Sydney, Michael suggested that Scott's death might fit that pattern, which helped reignite Steve's pursuit of the case. Scott Johnson crossed an ocean to build a life with the man he loved. Instead, less than 3 years later, Michael Nolan found himself identifying Scott's body and trying to explain to police a relationship that, at the time, many people still felt had to be hidden. In conclusion, love is love. My sources were Wikipedia, ABC News, The New Yorker, The Boston Globe, BBC News, 9 News, and Deadline.
You know what about that case that I feel like I have so many more questions.
Me
Like
too.
it doesn't feel resolved to me.
No, it doesn't.
And that's
it's like, how are they
frustrating.
connected? Is he part of that group that was killing the other young gay men at the time? It just seems
Well, that's the part that I
so
want to know.
unresolved. And
Well, and he was only convicted, right, of just Scott's murder. So the
just
question
Scott's
is,
murder.
what about the other cases that are linked, that are similar MOs? What's going, like that just it makes me.
Those families deserve justice as well.
And I still want to know, did the brother-in-law get some of that reward money? Because that's another question of could there also be some form of motivation for confession?
Mhm.
if there was
I
a
agree.
monetary. I don't know. It all seems a little bit, it's all weird. I mean,
It is.
good for Michael and good for Steve for fighting to try to find
Mhm.
more answers. And it sucks that it was just like, this is what it is, and everybody moved on. And it took till, what was the first one? 2013 before
Yeah, 2011, yeah.
when they first were able to reignite
Mhm.
listening to I mean, and then it just kept on going, right? Of
Mhm.
trying to reopen. But it's so suspect that there's so many cases all around that same time. And to me, it seems like this is more than one person.
Mhm. I would agree.
And then going for manslaughter later on makes me curious if, he just didn't want to tell on the other people and was like, well, I'm just going to get a lesser sentence now. I don't know. It's very interesting.
It
That's an
is very
interesting one.
interesting. And when I came across it, I'm like, I've never even heard of this.
Me either. Me either. I mean, I don't usually I do a lot of international cases, but I'd never heard of that one. And it is heartwarming to me that Michael found love again. To me,
Me too. Me
I'm
too.
glad that that happened.
Me
But
too.
what a perplexing case that was.
Mhm. And I hope we get more answers eventually.
Me too. I mean, this is only this is still ongoing basically because
Mhm.
it was only a month ago that the parole did he didn't apply for parole. So it's
Mhm.
just weird. All right. Well, I'm going to take us way back in time for this next one, and I'm not going to give it a title because the title gives everything away.
Okay.
So I'm not doing it. You can't make me. I won't do it. Um, all right. So I'm going to go ahead and get started if you are ready.
I'm ready.
Today's story is not a murder. No one is found dead in a locked room. There are no bloody fingerprints, no mysterious poisonings, no detectives chasing a killer through foggy streets. Instead, today's story is about a government investigation, an investigation that ruined lives, an investigation that enlisted young sailors to spy on civilians, an investigation that became so controversial that members of Congress condemned it, and an investigation whose central premise was that being gay was itself evidence of criminality. I first came across this story while researching another episode, our episode on the Harvard Secret Court of 1920. If you listen to that episode, you'll remember Harvard administrators secretly interrogating students, collecting letters, forcing confessions, and expelling young men whose greatest offense was loving other men. While digging through those records, I kept encountering references to another scandal, a scandal unfolding at almost the exact same time, a scandal involving the United States Navy. The more I read, the stranger it became. Because unlike Harvard's secret tribunal, this wasn't a university acting on its own. This was the federal government. This was the Navy Department. This was an official operation. And the methods used were so extreme that people who believed that homosexuality was immoral were horrified. This story would eventually involve congressional hearings, national headlines, questions about government overreach, and a young assistant secretary of the Navy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Today, we're talking about the Newport Naval Sex Scandal of 1919,
Shit.
a story of surveillance, entrapment, fear, and the criminalization of homosexuality in America. To understand Newport, we have to first understand the America that existed before it. Because when we hear the word scandal today, we might think of public embarrassment, political controversy, a celebrity affair. But in 1919, homosexuality was considered something far more serious. For much of American history, same sex relationships had been criminalized under sodomy laws inherited from England. The language varied state to state. Sometimes the crime was called sodomy. Some called it crimes against nature. Some said unnatural acts. The wording was often vague. The penalties, though, were not. Prison, public humiliation, institutionalization, loss of employment, social exile, and the law wasn't the only problem. Religious institutions condemned homosexuality as sinful. Medical authorities increasingly described it as a pathology, a defect, a deviation. And by the 19th century, a new category of person emerged in the medical literature: the homosexual, or as many physicians called them, sexual inverts. Or as I call them, the gays, lesbians, the theys, the queens, the dolls, and everything in between.
Okay.
At the time, the doctors and psychiatrists debated what caused homosexuality. Was it hereditary, a mental illness, a moral weakness, a developed failure? But what they rarely questioned was whether it should be punished or corrected. The language sounds clinical to modern ears, but it was often deeply dehumanizing. People weren't discussing rights, they were discussing diagnosis. And when governments, police departments, universities, churches, and military organizations adopted these ideas, they began searching for homosexuals with the same determination they might search for criminals. The irony, of course, is that many of these men had harmed absolutely no one. Their crime was existing, loving, and being loved. The years surrounding World War I intensified those fears. The United States entered the war in 1917. Millions of men entered military service. Military leaders became obsessed with discipline, masculinity, physical fitness, moral conduct, not unlike what is being perpetuated in our current administration. The armed forces feared venereal disease, alcohol abuse, desertion, and increasingly, homosexuality. Military officials worried that same-sex relationships threatened order and readiness. Obviously, these fears weren't based on any sort of evidence. They were based on assumptions. But assumptions can be powerful, especially when they're shared by institutions. As historian George Chauncey would later observe, homosexual men were often viewed not simply as different, but as dangerous, a threat to social order itself. This environment created conditions that made Newport possible. Newport, Rhode Island. Today, many people know it for its spectacular Gilded Age mansions. But in 1919, Newport was also home to one of the most important naval facilities in the United States. The Naval Training Station at Newport had expanded dramatically during World War I. Thousands of sailors passed through, officers, recruits, civilian workers. The city itself became a strange mixture of military culture and elite society. On one side were the wealthy families spending summers in extravagant mansions. On the other were enlisted sailors earning modest wages. Newport was crowded, changing rapidly. And like most port cities throughout history, it contained social worlds that existed just outside public view. Among those worlds was a small network of men who socialized together. Some were civilians, some had military connections, some attended gatherings, exchanged letters, and formed romantic relationships. Many believed they were living quietly, discreetly, perhaps carefully enough to avoid attention. And sadly, that assumption was wrong. The origins of the investigation are still debated. Rumors circulated through Newport for years, stories about inappropriate conduct, whispers about gatherings, accusations involving local organizations, claims involving sailors and civilians. And by 1919, Navy officials had become convinced that a substantial homosexual network existed in Newport. Whether that network was as extensive as investigators claimed remains an open question. What is not disputed is what happened next. Instead of relying on ordinary police methods, officials devised a plan, and that plan would become one of the most controversial undercover operations in American history. The Navy selected young enlisted men. These men were instructed to infiltrate Newport's suspected homosexual community. They were expected to gain trust, make contacts, attend gatherings, accept invitation, build relationships. The stated purpose was to collect evidence. But what investigators meant by evidence would soon shock Congress and eventually much of the country, because gathering evidence did not simply mean observing behavior, it meant participation. Imagine being a 19-year-old sailor. Your superior officer tells you that there is homosexual activity occurring in Newport. You're ordered to investigate. You are told to identify suspects, obtain proof, and then you're sent into private homes, private conversations, private relationships. The sailors were not merely observers. According to later testimony, they were expected to allow situations to develop, to encourage interactions, to gain confidence, to gather information firsthand. The operation expanded. More names appeared, more reports were written, and investigators would become convinced that they were uncovering a vast hidden world. What many of them failed to recognize was that the methods themselves were creating serious ethical questions, questions that would eventually overshadow everything else. Questions like, how far should an investigator go? Can a government agent participate in the conduct they're investigating? At what point does the investigation become entrapment? And if a crime only comes to light because the government actively facilitated it, what exactly is being proven?
Right.
And those questions are coming. But first, the investigation would grow, and with it, a list of targets. Among the figures who would later become central to this scandal was Erastus Hap Crandall. Crandall was well known in Newport social circles. He would eventually become one of the most recognized names associated with the case. Investigators viewed men like Crandall as central figures in a hidden network. But as we see through much of this story, the evidence collected by investigators reflected their own assumptions, or maybe hidden inclinations and bias. Ordinarily, human connection was reinterpreted through the lens of criminal investigation. And once investigators began looking at evidence everywhere, they found it everywhere, whether it truly existed or not. This is a pattern that we see throughout history. During the Salem witch trials, the Lavender Scare, the Red Scare, the Harvard secret court, and now Newport. When authorities begin with a conclusion, evidence often follows, not because it exists, but because investigators became determined to find it. They would write down a conversation and condemn someone. I mean, that's how crazy this went. As the summer of 1919 progressed, reports piled up. Names accumulated, suspicions deepened, and the Navy believed it was really uncovering something significant. The men being investigated likely had little idea of what had been happening around them. Some may have noticed new faces. Some may have even felt watched. Most probably never imagined that young sailors had been assigned to infiltrate their lives. What began as a rumor was becoming a full-scale operation, and soon arrests would follow. One undercover sailor later testified that his orders were clear. He was to gain the confidence of the suspects, not frighten them, not expose them, gain their trust, become accepted, blend in. And I find this part especially heartbreaking and difficult because they're playing with people's lives. And on both sides, the sailors and the victims would have irreparable damage. The sailors adopted different approaches. Some presented themselves as lonely recruits. Others portrayed themselves as men looking for companionship. Some simply accepted invitations and waited. The goal was always the same: get close enough to gather evidence. But then came the question that would haunt the investigation. What happened if a suspect made a sexual advance? According to testimony and investigative records, the answer was deeply troubling. The sailors were expected to continue, to allow interactions to proceed, to avoid revealing themselves, and to obtain proof. In some instances, sailors later acknowledged participating in sexual activity as part of their assignments. Remember, this was an official investigation. The exact details varied from witness to witness, but the broader picture was unmistakable. The Navy had authorized a form of undercover work that required operatives to engage in the very conduct they were investigating. Even by standards of 1919, this was controversial. One congressional critic later summarized the issue in blunt terms. The government had effectively instructed young sailors to commit acts that they were simultaneously told were immoral and criminal. Think about that contradiction. Officials argued that homosexuality presented a threat to the military discipline, yet those same officials ordered sailors to immerse themselves in homosexual circles. Officials argued that such conduct was dangerous, yet investigators expected them to participate when necessary. Officials claimed that they were protecting morality, and yet they created circumstances many critics believed was fundamentally immoral. The contradiction became impossible to ignore, but in 1919, the investigation was still expanding, and investigators believed they were succeeding. As the operation continued, investigators compiled lists of suspects. Some were civilians, some had military connections, some were prominent members of Newport society, and others were working class men with little power or influence. And the net widened. Names were shared, associations were mapped, entire social networks came under scrutiny. And many without proof that any of them were doing anything gay. It was just specifically that they were thinking, it's based on assumptions, assuming that that's what was happening. Today, historians often compare these investigative methods to later anti-gay campaigns. And the logic was remarkably similar. Identify a community, place it under surveillance, encourage informants, collect names, expand the investigation, and treat association as evidence. The same pattern we would see later during the Lavender Scare in the 1950s. The same assumptions, the same fears, the same consequences. The Newport scandal was not an isolated event, it was an early warning. One of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation was how little concern investigators showed for the human consequences. Imagine discovering that a casual acquaintance was secretly reporting on you. Imagine learning that private conversations had been documented, that your friendships are cataloged, that your social life became government evidence. For many of the men involved, exposure meant catastrophe. Employment could disappear overnight. Families could turn away. Church communities could ostracize them. And newspapers could publish allegations regardless of whether convictions followed. In 1919, merely being accused could destroy a life. And investigators knew that. The operation eventually generated enough evidence, or what investigators considered evidence, to begin formal proceedings. People were arrested, charges were filed. The investigation moved from secret reports to public accusations. For many of the accused, the worst moment was not the courtroom, it was exposure. The sudden collapse of privacy, the realization that their names had officially entered records. Among the most significant figures to enter the story was a relatively young government official named Felix Frankfurter. At the time, Frankfurter served in the Department of Labor. Decades later, he would become one of the most influential justices in American history. But in the early 1920s, he was already known as a brilliant legal thinker. When Frankfurter reviewed the details of the Newport investigation, he was appalled. It's important to understand what made his reaction remarkable. Frankfurter was not a modern LGBTQ activist. He was not arguing that homosexuality should be accepted. His criticism focused on the conduct of the government. Even by standards of the era, he found the Navy's methods indefensible. In a memorandum that would become famous among historians, Frankfurter wrote, "It would be difficult to conceive of a more revolting proceeding." Those words landed like a bomb, not because they defended homosexuality, but because they condemned the government's tactics. And Frankfurter continued. He criticized officials for encouraging behavior they simultaneously claimed to oppose. He questioned whether the investigation had manufactured evidence rather than discovered it. I mean, they were encouraging these people to seek this out, to create these things. And perhaps most importantly, he challenged the idea that such methods could be justified in a democratic society. To Frankfurter, the issue was much larger than Newport. It was about government power. What happens when authorities become convinced that a particular group poses a threat? What limits remain? What protections survive? Frankfurter's criticism reflected growing discomfort among observers who had no sympathy for homosexuality, but nevertheless believed the Navy had gone too far. One lawmaker summarized the dilemma. If these acts were so reprehensible, why had government agents been instructed to participate in them? The hearings also exposed another uncomfortable reality. Many of the accusations depended heavily on testimony from undercover operatives. This created obvious credibility issues. The same individuals who had been instructed to obtain evidence were now serving as key witnesses. Meanwhile, the men at the center of the scandal experienced consequences that often went unrecorded. This is one of the challenges historians face today. Government records preserve the voices of the investigators. Newspapers preserve the voices of commentators. Congressional transcripts preserve the voices of officials. But the accused are often harder to find. Many disappeared from historical records. Some moved away. Some changed their names. And some simply stopped appearing in documents altogether. We know that their lives were disrupted. We know their reputations were damaged. We know careers suffered. But the personal aftermath frequently remains hidden. And in some ways, that's part of the tragedy. Queer history is often preserved through the records of people who sought to suppress it. Police reports, court files, investigative memoranda, government surveillance. The people themselves are harder to hear. Their stories survive only in fragments. As criticism intensified, the Navy found itself in an increasingly defensive position. Officials argued that extraordinary measures had been necessary. They insisted that the investigation uncovered a genuine misconduct. They emphasized concerns about military discipline, yet every defense seemed to create another question. Why were sailors selected? Who approved these methods? Who supervised this operation, and who accepted responsibility? Those questions eventually led investigators towards one of the most recognizable names in American history. At the time, he was not yet president. He was not yet the architect of the New Deal. He was not yet the leader Americans would know during the Great Depression and World War II. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And whether fairly or unfairly, the Newport scandal was about to become associated with him. The extent of Roosevelt's responsibility remains debated by historians today. But there's no question that his office had become entangled in the controversy. And as congressional scrutiny increased, so did political stakes. The scandal was no longer confined to Newport, it had become a national embarrassment. The internet often reduces historical figures into heroes or villains, but reality is usually a lot more complicated. The Newport scandal is no exception. There's no evidence that Roosevelt personally directed every aspect of the operation. There is no evidence that he personally recruited undercover sailors. There's no evidence that he sat in Newport while designing sting operations. What historians do know is that Roosevelt was informed about the investigation. His office was aware of it. And when concerns were raised, the operation continued. That fact alone places him under scrutiny. Years later, Roosevelt's defenders would argue that he relied on subordinates and military officials. His critics argued that he should have stopped the operation. The debate continues today. But regardless of how much responsibility Roosevelt personally bears, this scandal had become attached to his name. And for a young political figure with national ambitions, that was an uncomfortable place to be. After discussing Roosevelt's role, the Senate's final findings were brutal. Investigators concluded that Roosevelt and the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, had allowed a system that never should have existed. The committee declared that the rights of young enlisted sailors had been ignored. It criticized officials for placing recruits in situations where sexual activities was expected to occur. The report stated that allowing personnel to be put in such circumstances was a deplorable, disgraceful, and almost unnatural proceeding. The committee also criticized the treatment of the accused. And this part upsets me. Many men had been imprisoned for months before receiving formal hearings. Now, again, based on assumptions, not necessarily actual evidence, or that they were going to be convicted in the first place. Historian Sherry Zane notes that some suspects were confined aboard the USS Boxer for more than 100 days before court-martial proceedings were completed. They were held hostage. Families complained, religious leaders complained, even people who believed homosexuality should be punished questioned the government's methods. One group of the Newport clergy wrote directly to President Woodrow Wilson. They denounced what was called the Navy's vicious methods. That phrase appeared repeatedly in contemporary reporting, not merely mistaken methods, but vicious methods. For many Newport residents, the issue was no longer whether homosexual activity existed. The issue was whether the government had abandoned basic standards of fairness. They were enticing these people to these parties.
Mm-hmm.
The Senate's rebuke became one of the most embarrassing moments of Roosevelt's early political career. One modern historian notes that some investigators believed Roosevelt should have never been allowed to hold public office again because of this association with this operation. History, of course, would take a different path. Roosevelt would survive the controversy. The men arrested in Newport would not enjoy the same opportunity. Many disappeared from public record, many lost their jobs, reputations, and communities, and the future president moved forward. The targets of the investigation were largely left behind. The Newport scandal would gradually fade from public attention and other controversies would emerge. The country changed, decades passed, Franklin Roosevelt became president, the Great Depression arrived, World War II reshaped the globe. The names associated with Newport slipped from public memory. But the idea behind Newport survived. The notion that LGBTQ people posed a threat, a hidden threat. A notion that the government agencies could identify and monitor them. The notion that private relationships justified public intervention. Those ideas reappeared throughout the 20th century. Today, Historians view the Newport Naval Sex Scandal as one of the earliest large-scale anti-gay government investigations in American history. Not because it was the first instance of discrimination, because sadly it was not,
Right.
but because it left such an extensive paper trail. The documents revealed how institutions thought, how they justified their actions, how fear became policy, and how quickly civil liberties can erode when a minority group was portrayed as dangerous. For modern listeners, it's tempting to imagine that everyone involved knew this investigation was wrong, but many did not. Many believed they were protecting society. That is what makes stories like Newport important. Injustice is rarely carried out by people who think they are villains. More often, it's carried out by people who were convinced that they were doing the right thing. People who believed that the ends justified the means. People who stopped questioning their assumptions. Newport reminds us how dangerous that can be. As Pride celebrations continue across the country every June, it's worth remembering stories like this one. The fight for LGBTQ plus rights did not begin with marriage equality or television representation or rainbow flags. It began with survival. It began with people who risked everything simply by existing, people who formed friendships despite surveillance, built communities despite criminalization, found connection despite the constant threat of exposure. The men targeted in Newport never imagined they would become part of history. Most likely hoped not to. Yet their story remains a reminder of what happens when the government decides that identity itself is suspicious. A reminder that civil liberties matter most when they protect unpopular people. A reminder that justice requires more than good intentions. It requires limits, accountability, and the willingness to recognize when power has gone too far. My sources were the Senate hearings and congressional records regarding the Newport investigation, the Felix Frankfurter Memorandum, The Other Side of Silence, Men's Lives and Gay Identities by James Laurie, the U.S. Naval Institute, the Public's Radio reporting on scandalous conduct, the MIT Press Reader, the 19th's reporting on the Newport investigation and Roosevelt's role, the Boston Art Review, contemporary reporting from the New York Times, and Newport historical records and archive materials.
Man,
I know.
that's wild.
Isn't it though? They
Yeah.
literally told them, go try to entice men into sex and see if they'll start doing it. Try to
What the
find
actual hell?
try to find parties, try to get invited, try to see if you can coax it out of people, and then we're going to arrest them. Like
Yeah.
it's just mind-blowing, and they're participating in an act that is criminal. So
Uh-huh.
it's just the whole thing makes me insane. And
Mhm.
that happened in 1919. It was a scandal heard across the entire country. And then we know that in 1920, the secret court happened at fucking Harvard.
Mhm.
So it repeated. Like, it just blows my mind. And if you haven't listened to that episode, we did it last year during Pride Month. It is the Harvard Secret Court of 1920. I highly recommend listening to it because it does have modern connections of when they found out about it, which was in our modern era.
Mhm.
So I do recommend going back in the archives for that one. But I just felt like I had to talk about this one. It's just crazy to me. And
It
that it
is.
became such a huge reporting. I mean, it's like stacks and stacks and stacks of evidence that they collected, which also included conversations. Like they seem like they're friendly with that person, and
Mhm.
that immediately they're condemned.
Right.
It's just crazy to me, and how fearful they were of gay people.
Yeah.
Like it just shows you how scared they were of something different or something
Mhm.
that they didn't find
That they didn't
normal.
understand. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Anyway, that was my case this week. We will be back with new episodes out on Monday.
I have some info for you.
Oh,
I dug a little deep while you were telling me your story, and the reward money has not gone to anybody yet.
thank you. I needed to know that. That was going to
It,
drive me crazy.
I guess Steve is petitioning for it to go to the killer's ex-wife, um, the wife of the brother-in-law, because I guess
Oh,
she's the one that was
pushed it.
questioning a lot of it. So that's
Oh,
what he wants to happen. And I also found out that Steve Johnson is loaded. He was part of the tech companies in the 1990s and sold part of his company to AOL. So he got like
wow.
millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. So that was another thing I did not know.
Well, that's good to know, especially because, I mean, when you said that the family added an additional million, I was like, where the fuck did they get that kind of
Yeah,
money?
like where did that come from? Well, now we know.
Now we know. But here's another thing that goes to show you that it doesn't matter how much money you have, you're never, it doesn't necessarily mean you can find the answers that you want,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, it was helpful for sure,
Right.
but again, your case left me with more questions than
I
answers.
know, me too. I hope we get to find out more sometime.
Yeah, and at least a connection to the other cases.
I guess a Disney documentary is going to be done on this case, so maybe we'll get more answers.
Yeah, I hope so. We'll also let you know when that documentary comes out, and I'm sure we
Yes,
will discuss it on air.
I
Um,
would think we would.
yeah. Again, real quick, new cases always come out on Mondays. Do follow us on Instagram at Murder Not Murdering. We're also on TikTok, mnn.pod. We're on Reddit as well at Murder Not Murdering. And, reach out to us, talk to us. We're always willing to hear cases that you want to hear about. And thank you so much for listening to us and supporting us. It really means a lot that, I just ran into somebody at Pride actually who was like, I was just listening to your podcast. That's to me,
That's
that's
so
so
cool.
it's so heartwarming because
Yeah.
we're behind a computer. We don't necessarily know who's listening out there. And it's
Mhm.
definitely means a lot that you do care enough to listen to us ladies jabber about murders. So we
Thank
appreciate
you.
you.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And happy Pride Month. And we're going to be back, like I said, on Monday. Thanks for listening. See you next week. Bye.
Bye.